The air in the Redemption Creek saloon was thick enough to choke on a foul mix of stale beer sweat and the bitter smoke of cheap cigars. Every eye was on Judge Alistair Finch, a man whose gavel fell with the weight of a hangman's noose. He sat like a king on a throne of cracked leather, his face flushed with whiskey and power. Tonight his cruelty had a new target, the women. The town's spinsters and widows paraded before him like cattle. With a booming, heartless laugh that echoed off the grimy walls, he made his proclamation. In my unparalleled generosity, any man who has paid his dues to this town may pick any wife from this lot for free. A stunned silence fell, broken only by the judge's sneering challenge. Who will be first? The silence in the saloon stretched thin, a taut wire of humiliation and disbelief. The women lined up against the wall, widows worn down by grief and hardship, spinsters, whose hopes had long since turned to dust, flushed with shame. Judge Alistair Finch savoured the moment, his piggy eyes scanning the crowd of men, daring them to partake in his sick theatre. He was the law in Redemption Creek, a town whose name was a bitter joke. His justice was a commodity, bought by the highest bidder and sold to the most desperate. Most of the cowboys and ranchers nursed their drinks, their gazes fixed on the floorboards or the bottom of their glasses. They were hard men, but few possessed the particular strain of malice required to participate in such a spectacle. But one man watched from the shadows, his face a mask of weary resolve. Clayton Clay Monroe had not come to the saloon for entertainment. He'd come to plead with the judge for an extension on the loan for his small, failing ranch, the last piece of a life he was trying to rebuild. He'd lost his family to fever, his spirit in the war, and now he was on the verge of losing his land. He had waited for hours only for the judge to launch into this drunken depravity. "What's the matter, boys?" Finch bellowed, his voice slick with liquor. Afraid of a little commitment? His eyes landed on Clay. "Monroe, you look like you could use a woman's touch out at that dust bowl of yours. God knows you can't afford to court one. Step up, my gift to you." Clay felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. To refuse would be to defy the judge a death sentence for his ranch. To accept would be to sacrifice another man's dignity for his own survival. He looked at the women again, seeing the quiet terror in the eyes of Martha, the baker's widow, and the brittle pride of Beatrice, the former schoolmarm. Then his gaze drifted past the saloon doors. Huddled by a broken-down wagon across the street was a small family, clearly outsiders. They were plain folk Amish, by the look of their dark, simple clothing. Their horse had thrown a shoe, and the father, a man with a long grey beard and fearful eyes, had been trying to get help from the town's blacksmith, a man squarely in the judge's pocket. Standing beside him was his daughter. She was not like the other women. She was young, perhaps 19 or 20, with a face as round and plain as a milking pail. Her body was stout, wrapped in a shapeless black dress that did nothing to hide her considerable size. In a world where wiry toughness was a virtue, she was soft and substantial. The townsfolk had been snickering at her all day, calling her the Amish heifer, an idea cold and sharp cut through the whiskey haze in Clay's mind. It was a terrible, desperate gamble. He pushed himself away from the wall and walked toward the center of the room. The floorboards creaked under his worn boots. The judge grinned, thinking he had won. "Finally a man with some sense," Finch boomed. "So who will it be, Monroe the baker's widow? She can probably make a decent biscuit." Clay didn't look at the women lining the wall. He kept his eyes on the judge, his voice low and steady, carrying through the suddenly silent room. "I'll take your offer, Judge, on one condition." The judge's grin faltered. "Conditions you're in no position to—" "You said any wife." Clay cut in his voice like flint. "Does your offer extend beyond this room?" Finch's brow furrowed in confusion. What in damnation are you talking about?" Clay pointed a steady finger toward the open doorway at the large girl standing by the wagon. Her eyes widened in alarm as she realized she was the subject of their attention. "I'll take her," Clay said. "I'll take the obese Amish girl." The saloon erupted. First a wave of shocked gasps, then a roar of incredulous laughter. The judge was the loudest of all, slapping his knee and wheezing. He saw it as the ultimate joke, a broken-down rancher choosing the one woman in the territory, even less desirable than the spinsters he had on display. It was a punchline that affirmed his own superiority. "The Amish girl," Finch roared, wiping tears of mirth from his eyes. "By God, Monroe, you've got a peculiar taste. Fine, take her. A deal is a deal." He waved a dismissive hand. "And for providing such fine entertainment, your loan is extended by 6 months. Now get her, and get out of my sight." The laughter followed Clay as he strode out of the saloon. He ignored it. He crossed the dusty street, his boots kicking up little puffs of dirt. The Amish father, Jakob Stoltzfus, stepped in front of his daughter, his arms spread wide, a shepherd protecting his lamb. His face was pale with terror. "Please, sir," Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. "We mean no trouble. We are simple people." Clay stopped a few feet away, his gaze softening as he looked at the frightened man. He took off his hat, a gesture of respect the man probably didn't expect. "I mean you no harm, sir," Clay said, his voice quiet, now stripped of the saloon's bravado. "My name is Clayton Monroe. That man in there," he gestured back at the saloon, "is Judge Finch. He runs this town, and he was doing something cruel. I did the only thing I could think of to stop it." The girl, whose name was Hannah, peered out from behind her father. Her eyes, a startlingly clear blue, were not filled with fear, but with a sharp, assessing intelligence. She had heard every word. "You brought me to save them?" she asked, her voice surprisingly firm with the faint lilt of her people's dialect. Clay winced at the word. It wasn't like that. It was a choice between evils. He would have forced one of those women on some drunk, and I couldn't let that happen. And he would have ruined me. Now, he thinks I'm a fool. That gives us a chance. A chance for what? Jakob asked, his fear giving way to confusion. What is to become of my Hannah? This was the part Clay hadn't thought through. He had acted on instinct, on a spark of defiance he thought had died long ago. He looked at Hannah, at her broad shoulders and capable-looking hands. He saw not the object of the town's ridicule, but a person trapped just as he was. "I have a ranch," Clay said the words, feeling foreign and momentous on his tongue. "It's not much, but it's mine. The judge just gave me 6 months. I can't offer what you're used to, but I can offer safety from him. I can offer you a home as my wife." The word hung in the air between them, absurd and terrifying. Jakob Stoltzfus looked from Clay to his daughter, his mind reeling. To his people, marriage was a sacred covenant ordained by God and community. This was a profane mockery. Yet he saw the truth of their predicament. They were stranded penniless and at the mercy of a tyrant. This stranger, this English man, had in his own rough way offered them a lifeline. It was Hannah who spoke, her gaze locked on Clay's. She saw the shame in his eyes, the deep weariness that went bone deep. She saw that he was not a monster like the judge. He was a drowning man who had reached for the nearest log, and she was that log. "Father," she said softly, "the blacksmith will not help us. We have no money for feed. The Ordnung teaches us that God provides a path, even through the wilderness." She turned her clear blue eyes back to Clay. "I will go with you, Clayton Monroe. I will be your wife." The journey to Clay's ranch was a study in silence. Hannah's family with their wagon, finally repaired after Clay paid the exorbitant fee demanded by the blacksmith headed east, their hearts heavy with a grief Clay could only imagine. He had given Jacob nearly all the money he had, left a paltry sum that felt both like a bride price and an apology. Hannah had said her goodbyes with a stoic grace that unnerved him, her composure breaking only for a moment as she hugged her younger sister Sarah. Now she sat beside him on the buckboard, her hands folded in her lap, her back ramrod straight. She didn't speak, and Clay, a man long accustomed to the solitude of his own thoughts, found her silence more profound than any he had ever known. It wasn't empty. It was watchful, observant, a silence that seemed to absorb the world around it. He risked a glance at her. The setting sun cast her in a soft, golden light. The town's cruel caricature of her, as an obese girl, seemed to melt away. He saw instead a woman of undeniable substance, her features plain, but her expression serene. She was solid, unflinching. It was a quality he hadn't seen in a person in a long time. His ranch, when they finally arrived, was a testament to his despair. The cabin was a small, ramshackle affair, chinked with mud that was crumbling in places. The barn leaned at a precarious angle, its roof patched with rusted tin. The corral held only 2 bony horses, and the fields were mostly fallow, choked with weeds. It was a place where hope had come to die. Clay pulled the wagon to a halt and couldn't bring himself to look at her. "This is it," he mumbled, his voice thick with shame. "It's not much." Hannah surveyed the scene without a word. She climbed down from the buckboard with surprising agility. She didn't look at the dilapidated cabin or the leaning barn. Instead, her eyes scanned the land itself, the quality of the soil she crumbled between her fingers, the direction of the wind, the way the last light of day fell upon the western slope of the small hill behind the cabin. "The soil is dry, but it is dark," she said, her first words since they'd left town. "It has life in it still." Clay stared at her. He had only ever seen the failure, the weeds, the cracked earth. She saw potential. The first few days were a dance of awkward distance. Clay gave her the only bed, a lumpy mattress stuffed with corn husks, and took to sleeping on a bedroll by the cold hearth. They moved around each other in the small cabin, like 2 wary animals, careful not to touch their conversations, limited to terse, practical matters. "The well is low. I will fetch the water. The bread is ready. Thank you." Clay expected tears or recriminations, or perhaps a sullen withdrawal. He got none of it. Hannah simply worked. She rose before the sun, her movements quiet and efficient. On the first day, she took the meager contents of his pantry, a sack of flour, some beans, salted pork, and by noon had produced a meal more flavorful than anything he'd eaten in years. She scoured the filthy cabin with a relentless energy, using a lye soap she made herself from ash and animal fat. She mended his torn shirts with stitches so small and neat they were nearly invisible. She never complained. She never asked for anything. But she watched him. When he worked the fields trying to break the stubborn soil, she watched his methods. When he tended to the horses, she noted the way he checked their hooves. When he sat cleaning his colt peacemaker, a nightly ritual he couldn't abandon, she watched with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was a deep, unsettling sorrow. One afternoon, he found her behind the cabin, where the land sloped down to a dry creek bed. She had cleared a large patch of the weed-choked ground with her bare hands and a rusty hoe she'd found in the barn. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "A garden," she said simply, not looking up from her work. "It is late in the season, but with God's will, something will grow." We will need vegetables for the winter. Clay looked at the patch of land. He'd never thought to plant anything there. It was too rocky, too sloped. The well is nearly dry. You won't have enough water for a garden. For the first time, Hannah stopped her work and looked directly at him. Her blue eyes were clear and direct. The morning dew is heavy here. And if you dig there, she pointed to a spot near the creek bed where a cluster of willows grew, you will find water not far beneath the surface. The trees tell you so. Clay was stunned into silence. He had lived on this land for 3 years and had only ever seen it as an adversary. She had been here 3 days and was already reading its secrets. That evening, a tension of a different kind filled the cabin. A storm rolled in the kind of violent prairie squall that rattled the very bones of the house. Thunder cracked overhead, and rain lashed against the windows. In the flashes of lightning, the small cabin seemed to shrink, trapping them together. Hannah was sitting at the table, reading from a small, well-worn Bible bound in black leather, her only possession besides the clothes on her back. Clay sat by the fire, oiling his gun, the familiar metallic clicks, a comfort against the storm's rage. "That is the world's solution," she said, her voice soft but clear over the din. Clay looked up. "What?" She nodded toward the pistol in his hands. "For the world's problems, noise and fire and death. My people believe a quiet hand and a faithful heart can solve more than a gun ever could." A flash of the old bitterness rose in Clay. "Your people haven't met Judge Finch. A quiet hand won't stop him from taking this land. A faithful heart won't stop a bullet." "Perhaps not," she conceded, her gaze unwavering. "But that gun didn't stop the fever from taking your wife, and son did it." The words hit him like a physical blow. The air rushed from his lungs. He had never told her about Sarah and young Thomas. He had never told anyone in Redemption Creek. He stared at her, his knuckles white on the grip of the Colt. How could she possibly know? Hannah's expression softened the sorrow he'd seen before, now filling her eyes. "There are graves," she said gently. "On the hill. 2 of them. One is very small. A man does not carry the grief you carry for land alone." He had built their stone markers himself, hidden away where he wouldn't have to see them every day. She had found them. She had understood. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of storm had broken. The carefully constructed walls between them crumbled. He was not just her reluctant protector, and she was not just his inconvenient wife. She saw the wound he carried, and he, for the first time, saw the woman who carried her own burdens with a strength he could barely comprehend. He slowly, deliberately put the gun away. The months that followed Clay's 6-month reprieve from the judge were a season of quiet transformation. The alliance forged in the crucible of that stormy night, an understanding built not on words, but on shared grief, began to reshape their world. Hannah's garden, planted in the spot she had chosen by the willows, became a riot of life. Against all odds, squash beans and hardy greens pushed their way through the dark soil, nourished by the shallow well she had convinced a skeptical Clay to dig. He had been astonished when he'd struck cool, clear water less than 6 feet down. Hannah's influence extended beyond the garden. She showed Clay how to rotate the meager pasture, allowing the grass to recover and thicken. She made a poultice from comfrey root that healed a festering sore on one of his horse's legs. She seemed to possess an endless well of practical old-world knowledge that made his own struggles seem clumsy and ignorant. The ranch, which had been a monument to his failures, slowly began to breathe again. The change was in him too. Waking up to the smell of fresh bread, returning from the fields to a hot meal, seeing the quiet, constant industry of his wife, it began to chip away at the stone in his chest. He found himself talking to her, telling her about his father's dream for this land, about the war, about the son who had his mother's smile. He spoke, and she listened, her hands never ceasing their work, whether she was knitting, churning butter, or shelling beans. One crisp autumn evening, he returned to the cabin to find her humming a simple, haunting tune. On the table was a pie, its crust a perfect golden brown. "What's this?" he asked. "I found wild apples in the ravine," she said. "I thought it might be a taste of home." He took a bite, and the sweet, cinnamon-laced flavor was so overwhelming, so reminiscent of a life he thought was lost forever, that he had to turn away to hide the moisture in his eyes. It was more than a pie. It was a gesture of profound kindness, a reminder that life could still hold small pockets of grace. But their fragile peace was not destined to last. Redemption Creek and its master had not forgotten them. The first sign of trouble came in the form of the Barton brothers, Silas and Jesse. They were the judge's cudgels, two hulking, brutish men who enforced his will with their fists. They rode up to the ranch one afternoon, their horses trampling a section of Hannah's garden. "Well, looky here, Silas." Jesse sneered, his eyes roaming over Hannah with lewd appreciation. "Monroe's Amish prize, you fattening her up for winter, Clay." Clay moved to stand between them, and Hannah, his body tense. "What do you want, Barton?" "The judge sends his regards," Silas said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice near Clay's boot. "He was just wondering how you're enjoying married life. And he wanted to remind you that 4 months have passed. Time flies when you're having fun, eh?" It was a clear threat. 2 months left. Clay's hand instinctively drifted to his hip where his colt would normally be, but he had stopped wearing it daily, a concession to the peace Hannah had brought into his home. The absence of its weight was a sudden, terrifying vulnerability. "Tell the judge I'm aware of the date," Clay said, his voice cold. "Oh, he knows you are," Jesse chuckled. "He also knows you dug a new well. Found some good water, did your funny thing water. Mighty valuable in these parts. A man with a good well can cause all sorts of problems for his neighbors." Their meaning was clear. The judge didn't just want him to fail. He wanted the land, and specifically the water Hannah had found. The spring-fed well was a resource far more precious than gold. After they left, a heavy silence fell. The trampled squash vines in the garden seemed to mock their hard work. "You should not have stopped wearing your gun," Hannah said quietly, her back to him as she surveyed the damage. "You hate the gun," Clay replied, confused. She turned to face him, her expression grim. "I hate the violence it represents, but I do not believe in offering my throat to the wolf. The Bible says, 'He that hath no sword, let him sell his garment and buy one.' It is a time for prayer and a time for swords, Clayton. Those men are wolves, and their master is the devil himself." Her words shocked him. He had mistaken her pacifism for passivity. He was wrong. Her faith was not a fragile thing. It was forged from iron, and it made room for the grim realities of the world. She understood the nature of the evil they were facing better than he did. The next week, their small herd of cattle, which Clay had been carefully rebuilding, was struck by a mysterious sickness. 2 calves died. Clay found tracks near the watering trough, the same shod horses the Barton brothers rode. They had poisoned the water. The final straw came when Clay rode into town for supplies. He was met with cold shoulders and averted gazes. Old man Hemlock, the general store owner who had always been fair, suddenly claimed Clay's credit was no good. When Clay pressed him, Hemlock glanced nervously toward the judge's office across the street. "I can't, Clay," Hemlock whispered, his face etched with fear. "The judge," he put the word out. "Anyone who trades with you will have their property taxes reassessed. I've got a family to feed." Clay walked out of the store, the weight of his isolation crushing him. Finch wasn't just going to take his land, he was going to starve them out, turn the entire town against them. He was strangling them slowly and deliberately. Riding back to the ranch, defeated Clay knew a choice had to be made. He could run, take Hannah, and disappear into the territories, or he could stay and fight. But how could one man fight a man who owned the law, the bank, and the town's fear? He was so lost in his thoughts that he didn't notice the rider until he was almost upon him. The man was a stranger, an old prospector type, with a grizzled beard and sharp, knowing eyes. As he drew near, the man's eyes widened in recognition. "I'll be damned!" the old prospector rasped, pulling his mule to a halt. "I never thought I'd see you again, not after what happened in Abilene." Clay's blood ran cold. "You've got the wrong man." "No, I don't," the prospector said, a grin spreading across his face. "A man don't forget the eyes of the fellow who shot the ace of spades out of the air at 50 paces. You're him. You're Silas Kane." The name hung in the air like gun smoke, Silas Kane. It was a name Clay Monroe had buried 6 years ago under layers of dust grief and a desperate desire for anonymity. Silas Kane was a legend, a myth whispered around campfires, a sharpshooter of impossible skill, a man who could make a pistol, sing a song of death. He was a gun for hire, but one with a peculiar code, never working for men he deemed truly evil. That code, however, had not stopped the violence from consuming his life, from attracting the kind of trouble that eventually led to a tragic, bloody misunderstanding that cost an innocent family their lives and sent him fleeing reborn as the quiet rancher, Clayton Monroe. "You're mistaken," Clay said again, his voice flat and hard. He urged his horse forward, but the prospector, whose name was Walt, moved his mule to block the path. "No mistake." Walt insisted, his eyes alight with the thrill of unearthing a living legend. "I saw you in Abilene, the Calloway gang. You took down all 3 of them in the blink of an eye. Folks said it was the fastest draw they'd ever seen." Clay's jaw was a tight line of granite. That was a different man, a different life. "Maybe so," Walt said, finally sensing the danger radiating from Clay. "But a man's past has a way of riding shotgun whether he likes it or not. You watch your back in that town. Judge Finch ain't the kind of man who likes ghosts in his jurisdiction, especially famous ones." Walt tipped his hat and rode on, leaving Clay alone on the trail, his carefully constructed world fractured. He was no longer just a struggling rancher. He was Silas Kane, exposed and vulnerable. A man like Finch wouldn't see a protector. He'd see a threat, a rival power to be eliminated. He arrived back at the ranch well after dark. The lamp was lit in the window, a warm, welcoming beacon in the vast darkness. He had grown so accustomed to that light, to the quiet peace it promised. Now it felt like a target. Hannah was waiting for him, a bowl of stew warming on the stove. She knew something was wrong the moment he walked in. The supplies he'd gone for were missing, and the rigid set of his shoulders spoke of a burden heavier than any sack of flour. "What is it, Clayton?" she asked. He sank into a chair at the table, the weight of his past finally crushing him. "He knows," Clay said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Finch, the town. They'll all know soon." And then he told her everything. He told her about Silas Kane, about the gunfights, the reputation, and the terrible day in Kansas when his speed and his fame had drawn a challenge from a jealous rival, a shootout that had caught a farmer and his wife in the crossfire. He told her how he'd run, changing his name, trying to wash the blood from his hands by working the soil, only to lose his new family to a force no gun could fight. Hannah listened, her expression unreadable. When he was finished, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. He expected condemnation, fear, disgust. He had brought the violence she despised not just into her home, but into his very identity. "So this is the grief you carry," she said softly. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a final missing piece of the puzzle of him. "You should leave Hannah," he said, the words tasting like ash. "Finch will use this. He'll paint me as a killer, an outlaw. He'll have a legal reason to come after me now. It's not safe for you here." "You are my husband," she stated, as if it were the most obvious and unshakable truth in the world. "My place is here. The Lord does not command us to abandon our kin in times of trial." "I'm not your kin. This was a bargain made in a saloon." He burst out, his frustration and fear boiling over. "It wasn't real. It is real to me," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that silenced him. "And it is real to God. I will not run. We will face this together." She stood up and went to the heavy wooden chest at the foot of their bed, her dowry chest, which her father had insisted on leaving, though it contained little more than linens and her Bible. From its depths, she retrieved a long cloth-wrapped bundle. She placed it on the table before him and slowly unwrapped it. It was a rifle, but not just any rifle. It was a beautifully crafted Pennsylvania long rifle, its maple stock polished to a rich gleam and adorned with simple, elegant brass fittings. It was the kind of rifle used by Amish and Mennonite hunters for generations, a tool of sustenance, not of violence, but lethally accurate in the right hands. "My grandfather," Hannah explained, her hand resting on the stock. "He was a great hunter. He taught me to shoot, not for sport, for food and for protection against wolves." Her eyes met his, and he understood her meaning. "The wolves are at our door, Clayton. It is time to sell your garment." The news of Silas Kane's presence spread through Redemption Creek like a prairie fire. Walt the prospector, lubricated by a few glasses of whiskey, had told the story to anyone who would listen at the saloon. The reaction was a volatile mix of fear and excitement. Some saw Clay as a dangerous outlaw validating the judge's campaign against him. Others, a small but growing faction who chafed under Finch's rule, saw him as a potential savior. Judge Finch was furious. The existence of a man like Silas Kane in his territory was an intolerable challenge to his authority. It also complicated his plan. He couldn't just send the Barton brothers to bully a man with Kane's reputation. A public showdown could easily go wrong. He needed a way to neutralize him, to turn the legend against itself. He found his weapon in the Territorial Gazette. A week after Walt's revelation, a wanted poster appeared on the sheriff's bulletin board. It was old and faded from Kansas, but the sketch was undeniably of a younger Clay. Wanted dead or alive. Silas Kane, 500 reward for questioning in the deaths of the Abernathy family. The charge was a lie, a perversion of the truth. Clay had been cleared of any wrongdoing in the Abernathy tragedy. It had been ruled a case of self-defense against a known aggressor, but facts were flimsy things in the face of a bold headline and a dollar amount. Finch now had his legal justification. Clay Monroe was no longer a rancher. He was a fugitive from justice, and the judge, as the highest legal authority in Redemption Creek, was now honor-bound to bring him in. He had the law, the poster, and the town's fair all on his side. The storm had finally broken. The wanted poster was a declaration of war. Sheriff Elias Thorne, a man whose spine had been slowly eroded by years of looking the other way, tacked it up with a heavy heart. He was a decent man, trapped in an indecent position, but even he knew this was a bridge too far. He sent his young deputy, a boy named Billy, to ride out to the Monroe Ranch under the cover of dusk. "Tell him the judge is forming a posse in the morning," Thorne instructed, his voice low. Tell him to be careful." Clay received the news with a grim sense of inevitability. He and Hannah stood in the yard as the deputy relayed the message, the last rays of sunlight painting the sky in bloody streaks of orange and purple. "So he twists the law into a hangman's knot," Clay said more to himself than to anyone else. "He does not have the law," Hannah corrected him firmly. "He has a piece of paper with lies printed on it. Truth is the law, Clayton, and the truth is on our side." But Clay knew that the truth was a poor shield against a bullet. That night, the peace of their home was gone, replaced by the cold calculus of survival. He took out the Colt peacemaker, its weight both a burden and a grim comfort. He cleaned and oiled it with a practiced efficiency that made Hannah's heart ache. He was no longer just her husband, the quiet man who was rediscovering life. He was becoming Silas Kane before her very eyes. While he prepared his weapons, Hannah prepared hers. She gathered her herbs and medicines, bandaging cloths and salves. She baked bread and packed dried meat and filled canteens with water from their well. If he was preparing for a battle of fire, she was preparing for a battle of endurance. In the pre-dawn chill, they received an unexpected visitor. A wagon, its wheels creaking softly, pulled up to their cabin. It was Jakob Stoltzfus, Hannah's father. Beside him sat two other stern-faced, bearded Amish men. "Hannah, my child," Jakob said, his voice thick with emotion as he embraced his daughter. "Father, it is not safe for you here," Hannah said, her composure finally cracking as she clung to him. "When a wolf attacks one sheep, the flock does not scatter," Jakob said, his eyes finding Clay's. "We heard the news. The peddler who brings us our goods told us of the judge's lies. Our people do not meddle in the affairs of the English. But you are Hannah's husband. You are kin. We cannot raise a weapon to help you, for it is against our way. But we will not stand by and let this evil be done." He and the other men began to unload the wagon. It was filled not with weapons, but with tools and supplies, axes, shovels, heavy timbers, barrels of water, sacks of grain and blankets. They had come not to fight, but to fortify. They would help them withstand a siege. As the sun rose, a small but significant trickle of support began to arrive from the town itself. The first was the blacksmith, a burly German named Schmidt, who had long chafed under Finch's thumb. He carried a heavy hammer and a look of grim determination. Then came Martha, the baker's widow, the very woman Clay had saved from humiliation in the saloon. She brought baskets of food and a fierce loyalty in her eyes. Old Man Hemlock from the general store, his conscience having finally won out over his fear, arrived with a wagon full of ammunition and supplies, his face a mask of defiance. "He can't ruin all of us," Hemlock declared, unloading a crate of rifle cartridges. "This ain't a town anymore. It's his personal kingdom. It's time that changed." The ranch was transformed into a makeshift fortress. The Amish men, with their master carpentry skills, helped Clay and Schmidt barricade the windows and reinforce the doors of the cabin and barn. The women organized the supplies, creating a field kitchen and a small infirmary in the root cellar. Hannah was the calm center of the storm. She moved among the small group, offering quiet words of encouragement, a cool drink of water, a piece of fresh bread. Her presence was a steadying force. The townspeople who had once pitied or mocked her now looked at her with a newfound respect. They saw not the obese Amish girl, but a woman of incredible strength and grace, the immovable rock upon which their small rebellion was being built. She was the reason they were here. Her kindness, her remedies, her quiet dignity had touched them all in small ways over the past months. Clay might be the gun, but she was the cause. From the ridge overlooking his ranch, Clay watched through a spyglass as Judge Finch's posse gathered on the outskirts of town. It was a motley collection. The Barton brothers were at the forefront, their faces eager for violence. Behind them were a half-dozen hired guns, hard-faced men Clay didn't recognize, likely drifters, and outlaws paid with the judge's coin. And trailing behind them, looking reluctant and sick, were a few townsmen the judge had deputized against their will. "They're coming," Clay said, his voice low. He looked at the small group assembled around him. A blacksmith, a store owner, a baker's widow, and 3 Amish men, armed with faith and hammers. And Hannah. It wasn't an army, it was a community. It was a stand. "Clayton," Hannah said, placing her hand on his arm. Her touch was firm, grounding him. "Remember who you are. You are not Silas Kane, the gunfighter. You are Clayton Monroe, a husband and a rancher defending his home. Fight for what you have built here, not for what you left behind." He looked into her clear blue eyes and saw not a wife of convenience, but his partner in every sense of the word. She had given him back his life. Now he would fight to protect theirs. He slung his rifle over his shoulder and checked the Colt on his hip. The time for waiting was over. The posse rode through the morning haze, a grim procession of greed and coercion. Judge Finch did not ride with them. He preferred to command from the comfort of his office, awaiting the news of his victory. The Barton brothers led the charge, their brutish confidence amplified by the half-dozen hardened gunslingers flanking them. At the Monroe Ranch, the defenders took their positions. Schmidt, the blacksmith, took cover behind a barricade of feed sacks in the barn, his heavy buffalo rifle resting on the edge. Hemlock, surprisingly proficient with a Winchester, settled in behind the woodpile. Clay positioned himself at an upper window of the cabin, the Pennsylvania long rifle resting on the sill, its long barrel glinting in the sun. It felt different from his Colt, less an extension of his own violent past, and more a tool for a specific righteous purpose. Hannah and the other women were in the root cellar tending to Martha's young son and preparing for the inevitable casualties. The Amish men, true to their word, took no part in the armed defense, but stood ready to put out fires and render aid. "Monroe," Silas Barton's voice boomed across the yard. "You're a wanted man. The judge has issued a warrant for your arrest. Come on out with your hands high, and we'll make this easy on ya. The only warrant you serve is greed." "Barton," Clay shouted back, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "Turn your horses around and ride away. This is your only warning." A sneering laugh was his answer. "Brave words for a dead man," Jesse Barton yelled, and then all hell broke loose. The first volley of shots ripped through the air, splintering the wood of the cabin walls and kicking up dust around the yard. Clay didn't return fire. He waited, his breathing slow and steady, just as Hannah's grandfather had likely taught her. Patience. One shot, one purpose. One of the hired guns, an overeager man with a bright red bandana, broke from cover and made a dash for the side of the barn. The long rifle in Clay's hands bucked once. The crack of the shot was sharp and distinct, different from the roar of the outlaw's pistols. The man in the red bandana screamed and collapsed, clutching a shattered kneecap. A non-lethal but definitive statement. The attack faltered. These were men paid to intimidate and kill, not to face a marksman of surgical precision. They were used to chaotic close-quarters brawls, not a disciplined defense from an unseen foe. From the barn, Schmidt's buffalo rifle roared the heavy slug, tearing a huge chunk from the corner of the water trough, where another gunman was hiding, sending him scrambling back in terror. The defenders were not just firing wildly, they were controlling the battlefield. Enraged, Silas Barton screamed at his men. "He can't shoot all of us! Spread out! Burn him out!" Two of the outlaws, carrying torches they'd prepared, ran toward the barn. This was the moment Clay had been waiting for. He drew his Colt, the familiar weight settling in his hand like a grim homecoming. The transformation was complete. His movements were fluid, economical, the muscle memory of 1,000 gunfights taking over. He fired twice in rapid succession. The shots were not aimed to kill. The first struck the torch in one man's hand, sending it flying. The second hit the dirt just in front of the other man's feet, the ricochet whining past his ear with the sound of an angry hornet. Both men dove for cover, their appetite for arson gone. The battle raged, a stalemate of flying lead and shattered nerves. The defenders were pinned down, but the attackers could not advance. Then the balance shifted. Jesse Barton, using the chaos as cover, managed to sneak around the back of the cabin. Clay focused on the men in the front, didn't see him. Jesse kicked open the back door, his pistol raised, a triumphant leer on his face. He expected to find a cowering woman. Instead, he found Hannah. She was coming up from the root cellar with a bucket of water. They froze, seeing each other at the same instant. Jesse's eyes widened, and he brought his gun to bear on her. "Well, now looks like I get the prize after all." He never finished the sentence. With a speed that defied her size, Hannah swung the heavy wooden bucket in a wide arc. It connected with the side of Jesse's head with a sickening thud. He staggered back, his pistol discharging into the ceiling as he crumpled to the floor unconscious. Just then, the sound of a new gun entered the fray, this one from the road. Sheriff Thorne, his face pale but resolute, had arrived with his deputy and a handful of armed townsmen who had finally found their courage. "This is the law," Thorne bellowed, his voice cracking but firm. "Lay down your arms. You're firing on citizens of this county." Seeing their employer's authority challenged and their numbers now matched, the hired guns lost their nerve. One by one, they threw down their weapons. Silas Barton, seeing his brother fall and his reinforcements turn into enemies, let out a roar of fury and charged the cabin, firing wildly. Clay met him on the porch. It wasn't a duel of legends. It was a messy, brutal, close-quarters fight. Clay fired, but his shot only grazed Barton's shoulder. Barton crashed into him, and they tumbled to the ground, grappling for control of Clay's pistol. Barton was stronger, his hands like vices, forcing the barrel of the gun back toward Clay's own face. As Clay struggled, his strength failing, he saw Hannah standing in the doorway, her face a mask of fierce determination. She held her grandfather's rifle not shouldered to fire, but held like a club. He saw the flash of wood, heard the crack of it connecting with Barton's skull, and then the big man went limp on top of him. Silence fell over the ranch, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded outlaw and the ringing in Clay's ears. He pushed the unconscious form of Silas Barton off him and staggered to his feet. He looked at the chaos around him, the splintered wood, the smoking guns, the blood in the dirt. Then he looked at his wife, standing in the doorway, bruised but unbowed, the broken stock of her family rifle in her hand. The battle was over. The aftermath of the fight at the Monroe Ranch sent a shock wave through Redemption Creek. When Sheriff Thorne rode back into town with the Barton brothers and their hired guns in irons, the spell of fear that Judge Finch had cast for years was irrevocably broken. The sight of the town's bullies defeated and bleeding being locked in the jail cells was a more powerful testimony than any legal argument. Finch, barricaded in his office, was apoplectic. He demanded that Thorne release his men and arrest Monroe, brandishing the wanted poster like a holy scripture. But the paper was worthless now. The deputized citizens who had fought alongside Thorne were there, as were Hemlock and Schmidt, their faces smudged with gunpowder and righteousness. They told the story of the judge's illegal war, of his attempt to steal land and water through hired violence. Their voices, once silenced by fear, now rang with the conviction of free men. By the time the territorial marshal arrived a week later, summoned by a telegraph from Thorne Judge Alistair Finch's reign was over. An investigation into his accounts revealed years of extortion, fraudulent land claims, and abuse of power. The wanted poster for Silas Kane was exposed as a manipulation of an old resolved case. Finch was removed from his position. In disgrace, his assets seized, left with nothing but the bitter taste of his own failed tyranny. He slunk out of town on a midnight stagecoach, never to be seen again. Back at the ranch, life slowly returned to a new kind of normal. The community that had forged itself in the heat of battle did not dissipate. Neighbors helped Clay repair the cabin and the barn. Martha brought food every day until Hannah's kitchen was restored. The Amish community came with donations of seeds and a new, even finer rifle for Hannah, a gift of respect from her father. The name Silas Kane faded once more, but this time it was not buried in shame. It was put away with a quiet acceptance, like a tool that had served its purpose and was no longer needed. Clay Monroe, the rancher, was the man who remained. He was a man who had not only defended his home, but had discovered he finally had a home worth defending. His relationship with Hannah had been forged in a crucible tested by fire and blood. The awkwardness of their beginning had been burned away, leaving something pure and incredibly strong. There were no grand declarations of passion, no whirlwind romance. Theirs was a love built on a foundation of shared hardship, mutual respect, and a deep, unspoken understanding. It was in the way he brought her the first wildflower of spring, and the way she knew exactly how he liked his coffee. It was in the shared silence, as they watched the sunset from their porch, a silence that was no longer empty, but full of peace. One evening months later, Clay was watching Hannah in her garden, which was now twice as large and flourishing with life. She was humming that same simple tune she had on the day she'd baked the apple pie. He walked over to her, his footsteps soft on the rich earth she had nurtured. She looked up at him, her round face breaking into a gentle smile, her blue eyes as clear as the water in their well. "The soil is good here," she said. Clay reached out and took her hand. Her hand was calloused and strong, fitting perfectly into his own. "It's not the soil, Hannah," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "It's you. You're what made this place grow." She squeezed his hand, her simple touch conveying everything that words could not. They had been brought together by a tyrant's cruel joke, two outcasts in a town with a broken name. But here, on this small patch of land, surrounded by the life they had fought for and nurtured together, they had found their own true redemption. The story of Clay and Hannah reminds us that heroes are often found in the most unlikely of places. It shows that true strength isn't always measured by the speed of a gunslinger's draw, but by the quiet resilience of a loving heart. Their journey, which began with a cruel joke, became a powerful testament to the fact that courage, partnership, and decency can bloom even in the harshest of soils, proving that a person's worth is never defined by the scorn of others, but by the content of their character and the love they choose to build. If this story of unexpected love and frontier justice moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share it with someone else who loves a tale where the underdog comes out on top. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next story from the heart of the Old West. Your support helps us keep these legends alive. Thank you for listening.